We're going to start a series this morning on the 7 signs in John's Gospel. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but John writes his story about Jesus in a far different way than what Matthew, Mark and Luke write their story of Jesus. It's not that they were different or the other disciples decided to give a different angle on everything, but John is trying to write his gospel at a time when probably he's the only disciple left. All the other disciples have been martyred, and their stories in their Gospels were circulating. And so John is inspired by God to write his Gospel. And he does it in a different way. And he's trying to really, I think, confirm that all that people have heard about Jesus is true, but that he did come for a specific purpose. And throughout his life there were signs that always pointed him to being the Son of God. And so we have in his gospel, the first part is dedicated to signs that, although were miracles, showed that he was the Son of God. And there are 7 of them in the Gospel of John. We're going to look at the first one this morning. Jesus turns water into wine, and there's the healing of the official's son, the healing of the lame man, Jesus walking on water, Jesus feeds the 5,000, Jesus restores sight to the blind, and Jesus raising Lazarus from the grave. So all these miracles, not only were they great miracles for the people that were on the receiving end of them, but they pointed in a personal way to Jesus as God's Son and the Saviour and the Messiah. And that's why you'll find in John's Gospel some of the things seem a little bit out of order if you read it through, compared to what we call the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. The others are written in not a sort of chronological order. They show Jesus' ministry starting in Galilee and being there, and then gradually moving south to Jerusalem. John's Gospel's not like that. Some of these events are all over the place. So John's not worried about a chronological order. He's writing them in a specific way, so it builds the story of Jesus up and how he is the Son of God. So there's the introduction, and the first sign is going to be the turning of water into wine. Well, that's a story we all know well, isn't it? I suppose that's not the first time you've heard about Jesus turning water into wine. I suppose you've read story a few times and heard a few sermons, no doubt, on it before. But John's book, by many theologians, is called the Book of Signs. So the first part, first 12 chapters, this book of signs, and the last part, the book of glory. So when you next read John's Gospel, it might be good to bear that in mind, because it is distinct from the other Gospels that we read, and is arranged in a special way to make these more poignant. But this is Jesus' first miracle. And it's at a family wedding. It seems to be a very good party. And we know that weddings at that time in Jewish culture, society, did go on quite a lot. And Jesus did this miracle, and the disciples believed him. That's the important. This is John says this is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He gathered his disciples. He'd been teaching them a bit, and this is where Jesus launches himself, so to speak, on the general public in a big way. And through this miracle, the disciples believed in him and followed him. Cana was the village of Nathanael. Cana, as you see there, is at the top. Nazareth was there. That's about 6 or 7 miles from Nazareth. There's some suggestions that Jesus' family had moved from Nazareth to Cana. But whatever there is, there could have been quite some good family connection between Mary and Joseph's family, Jesus' family, than the host, the groom and bride at Cana. And that for first century Jews wouldn't have been a long hike to go for a wedding. So that's what we need to remember. This was this first sign. And the family go, and family weddings were a big occasion. Always interests me when you look at the great Renaissance artists of the 15th and 16th century, and the way they display the wedding at Cana. This is one of the most famous paintings of the wedding, Paolo Veronese, a Venetian artist who was commissioned to paint this painting, and it's quite huge. It's 9 metres by 6 metres, so it's quite a big painting for the Solomon the Magnificent. At this particular time in 1563, the Ottoman Empire was the dominant empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Venice had become a cultural city, and so this is when paintings were ordered and the money was around to do it. And it's quite funny, isn't it? Because it's got nothing to do with a village wedding in Cana. And you even see that if it was, you've got Mary and Jesus in the centre and the head of the table. Well, that wouldn't have been true, but for artistic impressions, that is, you've got the Sultan is there, and you've got the bride and groom down here on the left-hand side. But there's elements of the story and the miracle in there. You've got the stone wine jars down here, and up here they are sacrificing lambs. And right above Jesus' head there's a man with a dagger. Quite interesting how these things are portrayed, isn't it, in the art world at that time. I don't know how on earth they used that painting to tell the true story of the wedding of Cana, but that's what it is. But anyway, Napoleon thought it was a good picture because he nicked it when he invaded Venice a few years later. He enjoyed it, and it got carted back to Paris, where it lay hardly noticed because in taking it away, such a large painting, it got damaged. And it wasn't, strangely enough, till the early 80s that the Louvre, where it had been stored, restored it. Anyway, we digress, but I thought it's an interesting thing with to do with the story when you look at Renaissance art of the artists. Sometimes I think some of the artists convey some great spiritual truths in their painting, but I'm not too sure about this one. But let's have a look at one or two pointers in this story, because you know the story quite well. Mary's statement to Jesus. She is there. Now, strangely enough, Mary in John's Gospel is only mentioned twice. She's mentioned here and at the foot of the cross. It's the only time Mary gets a mention in John's Gospel. Mary's statement. She turns to Jesus, who's obviously sitting nearby or whatever, and says, "They have no more wine," or words to that effect. With the implication, obviously, that Mary wants Jesus to do something about it. What did she expect, I wonder? It was. Some people suggest that perhaps the wedding was one of her daughter's weddings, or another son, brother of Jesus. But there's nothing for that to go on. I don't go along too much with that. But there they are. She sort of poses this question. Well, they're running out of wine. Somebody's come up and told me. Why did they tell Mary before it was announced throughout the wedding? Oh, I'm terribly sorry, we've run out of wine. What would be the result? It would certainly be a bit embarrassing for everybody, wasn't it? Why did one of the folks in charge of the refreshments at the wedding say to Mary first, I wonder, rather than everything else? What did they know? Obviously, I think some of the rumours were probably going around at this time that Jesus was a bit of a miracle worker. His miracles weren't public, but perhaps it was on the good luck. And of course, the other thing is Jesus rebukes her, doesn't he? We saw that film, which is based on the Good News version, says, "Woman, why do you involve me?" It's not very nice for a son to say that to a mother, is it? Yeah, so, it's a bit off. You would think, especially as the Son of God, saying that to his mother. Well, there's various debates in what words Jesus used. Definitely woman, but woman could have been used as a good form of address, as rather than a derogatory one. We would say, if somebody said to me, if I said to my mother, woman, it would almost appear that I'm talking down to her. Wouldn't you agree? It's not the sort of term you would, in any circumstances, you would speak to your mother. But we realise in Aramaic, that word and in the Greek, it's got a slightly different flavour. It just might, be something a bit different. I don't think we need to take too much into that. But Mary was definitely challenging Jesus at this time to do something about this wine. Perhaps all these years I've known that you are someone special. Isn't it about time you got going? Is that what's behind Mary's statement? In that behind? Who knows? But just to remind ourselves, it got Jesus up to do it. Good things that Jesus, full of grace, would use. He would do something about this. Because, as we said, weddings were special, big village occasions, and to run out of wine wouldn't be a good sign, and many guests would have left early. And so Jesus goes to these pots and fills them up with wine. I like this quote by N.T. Wright. The present story has all the elements that we shall come to know well as we work through the gospel. It is about transformation, the different dimensions of reality that comes into being when Jesus is present and when Mary tells the servants, people do whatever Jesus asks. So running out of wine is not just inconvenient, but it's a social disaster for the family. You know, it's something they would never live down, and everybody would remind them for the rest of their life. Now, these stone jars that the Jewish people used, these were ceremonial washing. We've come across this several times. Most households would have washing jars, and as you came into the house, you were always offered to have your feet washed, because if you'd taken any distance or whatever, they would definitely get dusty because of the terrain at the time. So it was quite common. But it was also common that for Jewish people, but not in other cultures, that people washed themselves before dinner, because it was a hot and sticky climate, wasn't it? And if you wanted to enjoy dinner with friends, you know, you wanted them to feel comfortable, and so households would have stone washing jars. And I imagine that they wouldn't have as many as this, but for this occasion, some jars were lent or whatever to this place where they was having the feast, in order that there was plenty of water around. Now, they had to be filled, because they were probably empty because all the guests were present. But Jesus comes and speaks to the servants, and the servants do as Jesus asked. Quite remarkably so. They didn't think he was an idiot or a lunatic. Perhaps at that stage they didn't know what he was going to do. But when he told the head waiter, so to speak, to serve the water from the jars to the guests, something would have gone through their minds as, what on earth is he doing? Perhaps they thought he was going to try and encourage the guests to drink water, which would have been unusual. Water wasn't all that safe drinking in those days as it was now. That's why people often drank wine and often drank beer at that time, because the water was far from being pure. And to the amazement of everybody, it turned out that all these jars of water turned into wine. And not only that, everybody comments that it's the best wine they've had at the wedding. And that famous thing from the wedding organisers saying, oh, well, you always serve the best wine first, and as people drink more, you serve the ordinary stuff. And it's obviously special wine. And of course, as we work it out there, we reckon there was about 600 bottles of wine that Jesus produced in this miracle, which was quite remarkable and wonderful. And the day is saved and the wedding goes on, and everybody would have accounted as probably at the end of their, God, wasn't there loads of wine and booze going around that place? And everybody's there. But of course, the spiritual design of the feast couldn't be overlooked. It couldn't be overlooked because Jesus had a miracle. Jesus performed a miracle. Not everybody at the feast knew, but certainly the servants, his mother, and disciples did, and that changed everything. And I think one of the great things that this shows us is that Jesus, in his first sign, shows us that he came to bring joy to our lives and not judgment. Which is quite important for us to remember. I think in many ways people still believe that God is around and is a nasty God. He doesn't love people, he doesn't want them to enjoy life because, he doesn't alter the course of hurricanes or stop them or prevent earthquakes or anything else, aren't they? People see signs like these, what's going on in the world at the moment, as signs of God's judgment. Even in Christian circles today, there will be people, I'm sure, saying this is God's judgment on America, God's judgment on the Muslims, or whatever. Now, I don't believe that's true. But Jesus comes to bring joy, not judgment. He comes to bring freedom, not slave obedience to laws. The sign points to Jesus as the Word incarnate, the creator of the world. This is Jesus' sign to us that he has rule over the dominions of the earth, over creation. This miracle talks about transformation because, as we said, the disciples put their trust in him. We're reminded elsewhere in John's Gospel, John recalls that Jesus came so that everyone would have life and have it at its fullest. So this is a great story. It's about Jesus turning the old-fashioned customs of jars, washing rituals and everything else away from enslavement to freedom. In a way, he's talking about you don't need to go through these washing rituals to prove that you're a good Jew and a good law person, one who obeys the law. Because these washing miracles were part of the extended law that the Jews followed. It wasn't part of the Ten Commandments, but all the priests and the Sadducees added to the Ten Commandments as the years went on. And we hear in certain types of stories in the Gospels, don't we, where Jesus is criticised because he abandons these sort of laws. Well, Jesus is pointing out that he's come to transform people's lives, not to seek to judge them by the standards they keep to the Jewish law. So, the wedding is a foretaste of the great heavenly feast in store for God's people, says N.T. Wright. The water jars used for Jewish purification rites are a sign that God is doing a new thing from within the old Jewish system, bringing purification to Israel and to the world in a whole new way. And this is why we're looking at the signs in John's Gospel. Yes, they're miracles, but we also need to look at them as signs of what Jesus was going to do and what these things meant even for us today. Jesus doesn't want us to religiously follow laws. He wants us to follow him in the spirit of the law, in order that we will truly know him and be great servants to him. So that's the first sign. The second sign will be the healing of the official's son.